Edge of Chaos, starring Neurotoxin and Joe Ryan. Edge of Chaos is a free-flowing discussion, occasionally dealing with mature topics.
All right, everybody, welcome again to the Edge of Chaos. I'm Neurotoxin, here alongside Joe Ryan.
Hello.
And today we have a very special studio guest. We have with us Dan Johnson of PANDA, which is People Against the NDAA. Their website is pandaunite.org. Dan is the founder of the organization, and he will be telling us more about it and more about what this organization does throughout the show. Right now we just wanted to welcome Dan, so say hello.
Thank you for having me on.
Thank you for being on.
Thank you for being with us, Dan. So we want to talk a little bit about the NDAA. I mean, I'm sure we're all familiar with it, and our listeners are familiar with it, so we don't necessarily need to introduce it as a topic. Obviously, it's the National Defense Authorization Act. Now, of course, for those who don't know, these acts get passed every year, and usually
I didn't know that, actually.
NDAA, yes, is not necessarily that big of a deal by itself. So a lot of people, like politicians who were against the specific NDAA in question, get accused of voting for NDAAs like the next year or the year before. But we're talking about specific provisions in a specific year's National Defense Authorization Act, which have to do with indefinite detention and legal policy that calls the entire United States a battlefield. And I don't want to take too much away from our guest. I'd like for him to explain this. He does a much better job than I do. But that's kind of the basic gist of it. So just one other quick introduction is I think that in conversations I've had with Dan outside the show and with this organization and just research we've done, is that a lot of people who are opposed to this specific legislation get stuck up on the indefinite detention provision, which of course is a huge problem, and we're not saying we're okay with that. But there's actually a lot more to this legislation and some of the precedents it sets. And Dan really educated me a lot on what I didn't know about this legislation, and we've been doing research on this, and we've been shocked at what we've been finding, and just how deep this runs, and how serious of a problem this is. And even Joe, who kind of has a love-hate relationship with Ron Paul and Rand Paul, and
this is one where I'm marching in their parade, lockstep, right there, arm in arm. So yeah, this has to go away now.
So with no further ado, Dan, thank you for being on the show. We appreciate it. We're honored to have you, and if you could just tell our listeners what the NDAA is and why it's such a serious threat to our liberty.
And why is it bad, I guess, really is the main crux
why is
of
it why is it worse than even most opponents think?
Sure. I'll kind of go through like an elevator pitch as to why the NDAA is so dangerous, particularly the one in 2012. And then I'll kind of go a little bit more into detail. The NDAA, or National Defense Authorization Act, is an annual budgetary bill for the Department of Defense. So essentially funds the military. However, over time, it's kind of become a haystack where you start throwing needles into. A great example is the 2008 NDAA. Though the NDAA is only supposed to fund current national security policy, it ends up actually changing it, starting at least with the 2008 that we know of and probably others before. But the 2008 NDAA, or the John Warner National Defense Authorization Act, specifically sets aside a Council on National Security, or what we call a Council of Governors, which was later put forth by an executive order. This council is nothing that you'd think was really big. It was 10 governors, one from each of the federal emergency management regions, who are brought together in one National Security Council to essentially figure out how to handle certain disasters, such as tornadoes, natural disasters, man-made disasters, and even terrorism. And one of the things that they were assigned to do in the president's executive order was figure out how to use the military, as in the National Guard and the regular Army, on U.S. soil.
Oh, that's lovely.
And we thought that ended with Bush and Katrina, right? Most people go, oh, well, that would never happen again, right? That went so well the first time.
Well, that's actually my quick interjection question on that, Dan. Is it the same governors? Like, I understand it's not always the same people. Is it the governors from the same states? Or how's the membership doing if it's only 10 governors?
I'm not particularly. I think the governors are actually appointed by the president, if I'm not mistaken, because the executive order set up this an executive order based off the funding in the 2008 NDAA, set up this Council of Governors. It looks like they hail from different states all the time, but they're all appointed and selected by the president, and they serve a term of 2 years on the council.
But they're governors from states, right? They're state governors.
Correct.
They're just, okay, but they do alternate. They do cycle through.
Correct, and they're under the Department of Defense.
So see, this is interesting to me, just for a quick comment, because we're talking about executive overreach, and when I use that term a lot in our blogging and on the podcast, we're typically talking about federal executive overreach. But here you have the president appointing the governors of states, which those are state executives, right, to make these decisions for their states, going over the heads of their state legislatures, which, states have constitutions too. You can't do this.
So they're franchising executive overreach, is what you're saying.
Well, it's kind of turning into this medieval, this is going to be my viceroy, and he gets to appoint who he wants.
So wait a minute. So 2008, so Bush did sign that one then, I guess. And this is a minor political point, I guess, but if it was 2008,
right? Bush was in office when the 2008 NDAA, because that was 2007. That was December 2007. So he was still in office when that was passed. That was kind of his last
so he even did the 2009 one then, really, in that regard then. Okay.
Right, because they're passed in the fall.
So I guess, okay, so that is an example of the same kinds of things. I actually had one crazy friend who used to call the Katrina, let's call it the Katrina response, as it was, a dry run. And it's like, well, a dry run for what? Well, kind of makes you wonder, in light of this now,
I'm not jumping on the tinfoil hat brigade, but this does...
He was a crazy friend, yeah, admittedly,
sound
but...
like something that's...
This sounds like it's the legal precedent or authorization maybe to do that officially, not even under the guise of something else, which is kind of what they did with Katrina.
So anyways, so 2008, so if you want to go ahead and continue with your story. Dan.
Right, so just giving a little bit of history as to how the NDAA has kind of transformed from this defense spending bill into what we have now, which is essentially a omnibus bill they start throwing needles into. So this leads us to the 2012 NDAA, passed in 2011. The president requested the Senate, particularly the Armed Services Committee in the Senate, that they put in provisions in the 2012 NDAA that essentially authorize the president to declare any person a threat on a battlefield. And this is the key of the 2012 NDAA. You talked about how mostly it's focused on the indefinite detention provisions. Well, number one, I want to spear one myth in the head before we even get on with this. When the provisions in the 2012 NDAA were passed and signed into law by the president on New Year's Eve, that was in a yearly NDAA, so you would think that they might then expire the next year. However, the provisions rely on another Bush administration invention, which is the 2001 Authorization for Use of Military Force. And the 2001 AUMF essentially was used to go to war in Afghanistan. It was interpreted very broadly and essentially gave the president, as one man, the power to do whatever he wanted outside the United States and to non-U.S. citizens, which they later kind of reinterpreted that power a little bit. But in the 2012 NDAA, now you have the specific legal declaration that America is considered a battlefield. And that means you have more than just indefinite military detention. You have execution. You're considered a spy on an enemy battlefield. That's the category of person you're put in. So not only do you not have constitutional protections, but you don't even have prisoner of war protections because you're not considered a POW. You are considered a traitor. You're considered an enemy. And not even a traitor in the U.S. sense, but a traitor in international sense, which means we don't really care what happens to you. We can do whatever we want. We will do whatever we want to you. And it's a battlefield, so deal with it.
So my quick question on that, and I know we're going to have a lot of questions about this, obviously.
I already have one, too, yeah.
Joe, go ahead. Why don't you, Joe, go ahead. That's the last one.
Yeah, in reading through this, because what made the news, and I'll admit, I took my eye off the ball on this thing, and when the 2012 one went into an uproar, I had an occasion to look into it, but I didn't dig as much as I did as preparing for this show. I did not realize that they were basically building all of this stuff on the bedrock that was that thing signed in 2001. That basically this very specific thing that was signed basically in anger 3 days after we were attacked on our own soil by a bunch of just basically rogue Al Qaeda, you would say. This is now the justification to, arrest and detain U.S. citizens without trial as military combatants on our own soil. That's beyond scary. I mean, it's like if you had said that in 1999 to somebody that this was going to happen, that many years later, they would have thought you were one of those tinfoil hat crazies.
They'd look at you like they'd look at you like you had 3 heads. Yeah.
Right. They're like, "Are you kidding me? Who would ever let them get away with that?" Well, there you go.
It's called terrorism,
right?
Because it's meant to induce hysteria and collectively irrational behavior. Now, there's always politicians that are wanting to do this, but more so, I feel, politicians are people. And they can be just as irrational and just as hysterical and just as well-intentioned with stupid ideas as anybody else.
And sometimes more so, because they have a pulpit to
Right. And they have more to gain by looking like they're solving short-term problems. So it's just, I feel like we went hysterical over 9/11, and I was the guy after 9/11 saying, no, everything we're doing in response to this is a ridiculous idea, and it's going to come back and bite us in the ass. We're creating basically statuses and categories of people like terrorist that are not defined by the Constitution, and it's going to give the government an excuse to do things that are unconstitutional. And here we are living it.
Anytime you start wanting to carve up citizenry into different classes and groups, you're already on the road to hell. You're already there. You're pretty much
I'm with you there.
on a really short route to complete police state.
So I'm gonna go even further than that, and I'm gonna say once you carve out as a whole citizenry from person, you're going down the road to hell. Because you noted that in the Bill of Rights, not once in the first 10 amendments of the Constitution will you ever find the word citizen. Further, in the Constitution, you will find both the word person and the word citizen, and they are distinct from each other. And the implication being that if our rights come from the government, then indeed our rights are tied only to citizenship. Because without a government, there are no citizens of said government.
True.
But if our rights come from something other than government, then they're not tied to citizenship. And I'm not saying that the U.S. Constitution or Bill of Rights protect people outside U.S. soil. I'm talking specifically on U.S. soil, territories, and protectorates. However, if we are to say that rights do not come from government, they come from somewhere else, whether natural or God-given, then we are saying your citizenship doesn't matter. Any person that we bring to U.S. soil, whether they're from a battlefield or not, any person we bring to U.S. soil, any person on U.S. soil, must be afforded the same protections, or the government can just pick and choose and just call you a non-citizen, and that's over.
You're saying that they can basically declare you a non-citizen or not, can declare that these constitutional protections don't apply to you, and that you're now a spy on a battlefield. Can you clarify who has the discretion to make that declaration under these laws?
The president and anyone he appoints, or anyone he appoints the power to. So the president can transfer this power to, say, the Secretary of Defense. But
how's he not a king at that point? Can I really just go a dictator? I mean, I'm sorry to go to the top shelf with that one, but
talk about executive overreach. It's like
you can't get a clear definition. I just can't think of one. I mean, and people are looking at the Bureau of Land Management. It's like, come on, that stuff like that's really minor. Grazing rights is really minor. This is the shit I want people to focus their outrage on.
No, but
honestly.
If you think about this, I mean, again, and I'm not one of these crazy things. The Bureau of Land Management is somehow this arbiter of dictatorship. But you can kind of see how the resistance there. I mean, they're part of the executive branch. So technically speaking, not that Obama specifically would have done this. He could say, okay, the person in charge of the BLM in this region in Nevada can now declare people combatants and treat them this way. I mean, technically he has that authority. Yeah. And that's scary.
I guess.
Well, let's go even further than that, because what you're talking about is you're talking about theory. Well, I want to go to fact. There was an article published in the Washington Times on May 28th that, for anyone listening to this podcast, should blow your mind. The article was titled, "Inside the Ring, Memo Outlines Obama's Plan to Use the Military Against Citizens." Now, I think that's a bit of an inflammatory title. I don't think the title is terribly accurate. But if you go through this, you'll notice two things. Number one, a defense directive changes the language of the Department of Defense's a long-standing policy that they do not engage in civilian law enforcement to we do not engage in civilian law enforcement unless the president tells us we can. And secondly, a quote from the article, a U.S. official said the Obama administration considered but rejected deploying military force under the directive during the recent standoff with Nevada rancher Cliven Bundy and his armed supporters, close quote.
Okay, I withdraw my criticism. I guess it's really hard to separate these things. That once you go, we just said, once you start going down that road, what is it? It's like when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Right.
That's what it sounds like to me.
The only tool in your toolkit is a hammer. Everything becomes a nail.
So everything is a nail now. And when it's all about terrorism, that's the other. And I will say this, as much Red Scare as we had in the 50s or other times, I don't know that we went this far in those other times, did we? I mean, kind of, but...
I guess I don't know the policy details to be difficult for me to tell. I mean,
that was congressional overreach.
Up a lot of people, but...
That was like congressional overreach,
overreach is overreach. Here's the thing. When I look at the Cliven Bundy case, and I see a lot of the liberal and kind of pro-Obama, let's call it. I wouldn't really call it liberal. A lot of the pro-Obama criticism of Cliven Bundy. A lot of what I hear from them is calling these guys terrorists. This is catching on now. Oh, these are domestic terrorists, and they're Tea-bagger terrorists, Tea Party terrorists. Now, you don't have to agree with them. A lot of people don't. A lot of people think these guys are just nutty-ass ranchers out there that are just trying to shirk the law. I mean,
and a lot of them are.
Joe kind of has that perception of them, and that's fine. But once you're crossing the line and calling them terrorists, and it's like these are the same people that are bitching about Bush and all the people he called terrorists, but all of a sudden it's okay for them to do.
And I might hate these guys and think they're nuts, but I want them afforded due process under the law.
No, it's amazing.
Let's just say that.
Due process.
I'm not willing to toss their citizenship in the garbage and just persecute them. Right.
Well, because people tend to only get active or be interested in things that affect them directly. Yeah. Let's toss out some of the definitions of terrorism from the recent judicial actions we've seen. For example, and this is actually not judicial action, but this is very recent. We posted this just before the show, actually, on our website, pandaunite.org. Middle school students plan to break dress code. Principal screams terrorism. Now this is a bunch of middle school students on Facebook getting together and going, yeah, we're going to break the school dress code. And the principal now calls them terrorists and says that's terroristic activity. There in Oklahoma, you had anti-tar sands activists unfurl a banner. And because glitter came off of that banner, it was considered staging a bioterrorist attack. Not a bioterrorist attack. Staging a bioterrorist attack, which, if I'm not mistaken, is 5 to 15 years in prison and a felony in Oklahoma. Glitter. So once you create this category of people, and we were okay with it, or a lot of America was. I supported the Patriot Act at one point. In fact, very heavily. But I supported the Patriot Act and many things, and I know lots of Americans did, and some of them still do in this country. Not many of them, but some of them still do. And what we saw that back then was the government doing what they did in 1942 and what they've done before, which is we're going to create a category of people. And this category of people legally does not have constitutional protections for whatever reason, whether they're considered property as the blacks in the South were considered back then, or whether they're considered saboteurs in 1942 as Japanese Americans were. Now it's terrorists. But this category isn't you, so you should be okay with us creating it. And what always happens, as we've seen, is the government all they have to do is expand that category to include you, and eventually the category gets expanded to include people who are threats to the status quo.
There's a popular George Carlin thing I've posted on our show before. It's called "You Have No Rights," and that's exactly the example he cites. It's like, you think you got rights? Just go in Google and look up Japanese Americans 1942. And he's like, rights aren't rights if they can just be taken away. So they're just privileges. We have a bill of temporary privileges.
And every year it gets shorter and shorter.
Every year it gets shorter and shorter, right. If you read the news even badly, right, exactly. Well, so
my kind of recurring theme on the show has been whatever the government's doing to whoever you don't like today, it's going to do to you tomorrow.
Well, I mean, it's amazing how little we learn from things. The First They Came poem about Nazi Germany. First they came for the trade unionists. I didn't say anything because I wasn't a trade unionist. I mean, that's an extreme example. Everyone, that's a Godwin argument, whatever. But it's relevant. Like, people think of these things as, oh, they're historical. Oh, they used to happen, but they don't anymore. No.
And then the excuses that they start to separate the two, it's incredible.
Well, let's solidify what we've just been talking about.
Actually, I kind of want to ask you, Dan, on that.
Yeah.
If you could actually make the comparison and tell us a little bit about what happened in the 40s, and maybe with the Red Scare, since Joe brought up the Red Scare in the 20s and then the 50s or late 40s, like how similar was that policy-wise and really just law-wise and overreach-wise, and what was the end result? What was the enema for those things? And then we can kind of maybe switch gears to where we're talking about what we can do about this.
Sure, and I do want to cover the exact language at one point, just before we get to the second part. But as far as a comparison, I don't know enough about, like you, I don't know enough about the policy of the Red Scare to make an accurate comparison with that policy. However, I'll make a couple policy comparisons. The first policy comparison being in a little bit far back, but 1862. Many people are very familiar with Abraham Lincoln's suspension of habeas corpus. They know he suspended habeas corpus, and there was a civil war on U.S. soil. Well, in that exact same proclamation, Proclamation 94, he says that any person found disloyal to the Northern government shall be placed in military jurisdiction. He detained, or his forces detained, 15,000 Northerners, not Southerners, Northerners, people who lived in the northern states, without a charge, without a trial, and executed most of them. That's once they were placed in military jurisdiction. So in the Supreme Court case later, Ex parte Milligan, the Supreme Court said, you can't do that. That's absolutely awful. That was the worst thing that we've ever seen in this country, and you can't do that again. Of course, we completely ignored that. So looking at 1942. In 1942, we have an even closer policy comparison, because we have an executive order, Executive Order 9066, that is passed after the president utilizes the power. So President Franklin Delano Roosevelt declared martial law in Hawaii and detained 1,000 Japanese Americans before his executive order. So he used the power, and then he codified it into law afterward. And in that executive order, it says nothing about detention and nothing about imprisonment. It says simply that the military shall be given control over certain coastal areas of the country, which is essentially the battlefield concept, that the military has control over this area. Well, when you compare that to the timeline and the actual language of the 2012 NDAA, you look at the NDAA is what now legally and explicitly gives the president the power to kill American citizens without a charge, without a trial. However, this president has, and the president before him claimed, but this president has actually utilized this power and executed 4 American citizens abroad: Samir Khan, Abdurrahman al-Awlaki, Anwar al-Awlaki, and I don't remember the other man's name. But he's already used this power. And then they codified into law. In fact, one of the most interesting arguments you should read is read the argument from the government when the plaintiffs who sue, the Freedom 7 we call them, who sued the Obama administration over the 2012 NDAA Section 1021 and 1022, and said that this could be used to detain us. The government's first argument was not, no, it couldn't. It was, it already can, so why are you challenging the NDAA? Because the Bush administration has claimed in Hamdi v. Rumsfeld, Yasser Hamdi was an American citizen who was captured on the battlefield and brought here. He was allowed to petition for habeas corpus, and got it to the Supreme Court. And the Bush administration, in front of the Supreme Court, made 2 arguments. Number 1, we could detain him under the authorization for use of military force. Number 2, the president has this power under Article 2 of the Constitution in his inherent commander-in-chief authority. The Supreme Court said, we agree with your first argument, so we're not going to touch your second. We're not going to deny or accept it. And then the Obama administration, Eric Holder, claims that the authorization for use of military force gives him the power to execute American citizens abroad. And here at home, he leaves it kind of ambiguous. And then in May, when a bill to repeal the authorization for use of military force in Congress was going. It was the Adam Schiff amendment. It was going through or being debated in the Senate, and they were talking about, well, what would happen if we repealed the AUMF? And Mary McLeod, who's the deputy legal advisor to the State Department, she said, on behalf of the Obama administration, the president believes he has this power under Article 2 of the Constitution, and therefore a repeal of the authorization for use of military force would do absolutely nothing.
Oh, so we graduated from using it for the justification to, oh, we don't even need that, but we have it anyway.
Right, and this is the same pattern we had in World War II. The only difference is now Congress supports the president. At that time, Congress just kind of laid back and let him do whatever he wanted. And so now you have this legal justification in place, and the same thing FDR did. You have Executive Order 9066 in place, and you have the exact same power. The military taking control over certain areas of the country. And then it was only coastal areas. Today, it's the entire country. So the president can now send the military in after everyone. If we look at those two precedents, just for the United States, I'm not even going to go into Nazi Germany. If you want to look up the Reichstag Fire Decree, take the Reichstag Fire Decree, otherwise known as the Decree for the Protection of People and State of the Third Reich. Take the Reichstag Fire Decree, take the original Constitution of the Weimar Republic of Germany, which is what they had in place throughout World War II. Take the original the Constitution of the Weimar Republic, put those next to each other, look at the sections it suspends and or violates, and then take the U.S. Constitution and take the NDAA Section 1021, 1022, then take the Patriot Act. Put those beside the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights. Note what sections they violate. They are, if not identical, very, very close. So that aside, with the two times this particular policy of giving the military control over certain parts of the country has been instituted in the United States, we detained 15,000 the first time and executed most of them, and the Supreme Court said that was a bad idea, and we all went, oh, that was a horrible idea. And then in 1942, we detained 120,000, and then the Supreme Court didn't apologize, but the Senate did. I think we gave like $600 or something to each of the family members who were detained. But yeah, I know. Yeah, generous amount of money.
Sorry for that.
Yeah.
Wow.
Sorry for detaining you for 10 years. Here's a gift card.
Anyway, to stimulate our economy now. Yeah. Wow.
Right. So we did that, and now we're not learning again because we're letting the president use the power, and then put in a law to say his use of the power is now legal and was legal back then, even though there was no law backing it up. And now we have the exact same authority for the president to use the military in any way he wants at any point in the United States. And we see from the Washington Times and from that defense directive from the Defense Department that this president has considered using military force against American protesters. That's a scary thing.
Let me ask you a two-sided question, then we can move into what PANDA does and what your guys' mission is, because I think it's very important for people to hear this and become involved and participate. So kind of my last question is, well, first of all, if you could cover any more historical developments that you haven't covered for us so far on this would be great. I think the comparisons are great and kind of understanding both the kind of the specifics and the history behind this. But what was it in those two times, particularly I think the 1940s are a little more relevant, it's a lot more recent. What was it that ended those policies? Was there a constitutional ruling or Supreme Court ruling that said this is unconstitutional, this can't happen again? Did they just expire? Were they repealed? What happened to those executive orders and the legislation in question there?
So in 1862, it was a Supreme Court order, and it was the end of the Civil War. So the Civil War ended, and the Supreme Court said, no, don't you dare ever again. In 1942, the Supreme Court agreed with the detention, so that was a great idea. And there's nothing they're going to do to impede on the war powers of the president, much like our Supreme Court does today. And the end of the policy was a result of huge public outrage. I don't remember if they repealed specifically the executive order. I believe that's what happened, is they rescinded the executive order and then made a bill like 20 years later and gave them some reparations. So most of them were too dead to receive the money anyway.
Which, if I remember, the 40s, then that one had the advantage of there being a different president in charge by then. So,
right.
From the I'll rescind my predecessor's
no, the 1860s
bad idea.
had the same thing. Abraham Lincoln died before the war was over. So
Right. Well, that was Supreme Court, like you're saying, but
right. Okay.
I guess. But here's the thing I do want you to get to the Panda stuff too, but just real quick. What's interesting about both those, there was a specific war that ended both times. That sort of, okay, yeah, we can roll this back now, right? It seems like maybe the one difference, just in my observations, is that we're in a war that's just it's made up to be a perpetual one. Unless we murder every Muslim over in the Middle East, how the hell does this ever end? And it's like, and let me branch off. That doesn't even matter anymore. The word Muslim isn't even in any of these laws. It's like, even if we were just honestly really racist and just said, we're going to kill all, at least the ramifications would be way more like specific. Those were targeted a little more specifically. I guess what's horrifying about this is it's not just unjust on the face of it enough to get people outraged, but it's such a wide net, just like with surveillance, that it's like, well, when will it ever end? Now it just seems like perpetual.
It really is. It's a war on something that doesn't exist. It's a war on a tactic.
Right.
And it's a war that doesn't end. And that's actually kind of why I wanted to bring up the Red Scare, and unfortunately we don't have a very good comparison, because even though I think legislatively, policy-wise, Dan, you're right, this is what it's comparable to, because it's obviously authorization for use of military force. But the problem is the public hysteria and the enemy is very comparable to the communists in both Red Scares. And I remind our listeners, there were 2 Red Scares, not one. And the reason for that, the reason that's important is because, I mean, yeah, communists obviously were the enemy, and the Soviet government very dangerous. I'm not saying those weren't problems, but the way we treated the enemy at that point is just basically anyone could be an enemy, and it just giving the government runaway authority to do whatever it wants by labeling you as the enemy. And that's always been my problem with this. I'm certainly not a lawyer, so all these legal precedents are kind of as new to me as they are to our listeners, hopefully, in opening our eyes to some of the other comparisons. But that's kind of the comparison I was interested in, and it's very scary to me that we don't have that precedent, that the Red Scare really wasn't as similar to this as we think. We didn't really go on this martial law route. So with that,
indeed we didn't. And let me read off the 2 important sections from the law to just put nails in this and lock this down. 2 important sections from the law are, number 1, who is the enemy? And that is key, which you guys were talking about earlier. Who is the enemy? And number 2, what can you do to him? So section 1021b2, who is the enemy? A person who is a part of or substantially supported Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, or associated forces that are engaged in hostilities against the United States or its coalition partners, including any person who's committed a belligerent act or has directly supported such hostilities in aid of such enemy forces. Now, what's undefined? Substantially supported, associated forces, hostilities, coalition partners, belligerent act, and direct support.
Just a few things.
Yeah, there's so many trap doors in there. I don't know where to begin. Like, he totally was friends with him. He called somebody who said he was in the Taliban once, I thought. That guy's totally in Al-Qaeda, sure, yeah. Boy, yeah, how quickly does that devolve into innuendo and speculation, right? I mean, good Lord.
It absolutely does. And so that's why the way that terrorist is defined by the different agencies now is important. And that's why we went through a couple of those a little bit earlier. And if anybody wants to know more, they can go to our website, which is pandaunite.org. Go under our resources, go under who is a terrorist, find some more definitions. But what can be done to you?
Basically realize that you're a terrorist. Go ahead.
Realize that you and everyone you know is a terrorist. Correct. C, disposition under law of war. The disposition of a person under the law of war, as described in subsection A, may include the following. Note it says may include, which means we could include more, guys. This doesn't have to be all. Or we could just not include any of this and just include different things. But just to give you an idea of what we might do to you. 1. Detention under the law of war without trial until the end of hostilities authorized by the authorization for use of military force. Without trial. Let me repeat that. 2. Trial under Chapter 47A of Title 10, United States Code, as amended by the Military Commissions Act of 2009. Now, this means trial in front of a military court. Most of the time, American citizens who are not in the military have been brought in front of a military court to be tried. They have been detained and or executed. I cannot think of a single one who has survived the military court. 3. Transfer for trial by an alternative court or competent tribunal having lawful jurisdiction. Now, a bunch of legal gobbledygook, but essentially, the Constitution says you'll be tried in the state and district in which you commit the crime. This is to ensure you get a fair trial by a jury of your peers. This says if another court says it has jurisdiction over you, we'll give you to that one. And we think we can convict you better in that court. We'll send you there. Wow. 4, transfer to the custody or control of the person's country of origin, any other foreign country, or any other foreign entity. We can give you to whoever we want, whenever we want, wherever we want. There's nothing you can do about it.
Well, have you tried in Saudi Arabia where you could be stoned to death afterwards? Sure. Why the heck not?
Didn't we transfer a large number of people? Now, they weren't U.S. citizens or Americans by stretch of the imagination, but didn't we transfer a large number of detainees, people that were combatants against us, at least allegedly in Afghanistan? Didn't we transfer a large number of them to Egypt to be tortured? Yes, I used that word. Yes, it was torture. I don't want to hear anybody's mouth.
This is under Mubarak, I'm guessing?
Right, where they would be tortured to exact information, and basically, because you couldn't get away with that on U.S.
you mean
soil.
Enhanced interrogation techniques?
No.
Okay, right. Want to keep the language straight there.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it is rendition.
Right.
Which I'm sure many people who are familiar with this stuff in the Bush era recognize that term.
This is a really primitive example, or let's say juvenile one, literally, but why does this all sound to me like when you were playing games as kids and, like, some kid is really losing badly at the game and then he just does something that's way against the rules and then just goes, oh, well, I can totally do that because I have super awesome dude powers and that means that I can cheat and do these things. It's totally with the rules. They're making this shit up as they go, right? I mean, how is it not? And because you said it's always... the law always follows the action in this case. And so it's like they're literally just covering their own ass kind of really flimsily after the fact. And I don't even... it's like aside from just being outraged, I guess, and this is where it dovetails into what to do. You know, what can a person do? And that's exactly what PANDA does, right? And I'm sure all our listeners by now are horrified enough to really be interested in the what can we do part of it, because, wow, it makes your head spin. It really does.
You're welcome. It made my head spin when I first got started too. Like, I was never really interested in politics. Poly being many and ticks being blood-sucking creatures, and it still fits. Even though I've said that joke so many times, it kind of bores me. It still fits. It very much fits, and I didn't really want to get involved with it, but I found it was the only way to actually make a real difference, because it controls everything. It's basically who gets what, when, and how. And still wanted to stay out of it till the end of college. Came across a video called 61 Senators Betrayed You today on YouTube when I was procrastinating homework. And I remember staring at that video going, nah, 61 senators couldn't betray me. That's ridiculous. So I watched the video anyway. And it was about the NDAA. It was 5 minutes of news and C-SPAN on the 2012 NDAA, which I'll just refer to as the NDAA from now on. And I just remember sitting there in shock, and that we had to do something about it. So the way PANDA kind of takes this on, so to speak, is we are activist trainers. We have been there, done that. We've taken 5 or 6 cities before we reached out to the NDAA resistance to take the others. We've worked at the state level. We have done a lot of effort in the field. We are now activist trainers. So we're here for people who want help. Because when you say we need to take back our liberty and our freedom, what you're telling people is you don't really have to, because there are other people who will do it, because we will do it. It's kind of the guiding principle behind communism or socialism. On paper, it works really well, but in practice, it's we just means I get to slack off and I hope that some other people do the work. So we don't really have that. We are activist trainers, and if you want to take back your city, if you want to do something about the NDAA, we help you. If not, great, we are the people to help. So the process that we encourage people to take is to start at the local level. The reason is government has been shown not to really follow pieces of paper called law. They don't do a good job at that.
No, they don't.
Ever. And if you're a student of history, you realize it's not just recently all of a sudden our representatives got bought. All of a sudden, special interests showed up.
And it depends on, like, bought by emotion, bought by money, bought by, rhetoric, whatever.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. They have always been controlled by outside forces. The extent of which may be a little bit increased now, but they've always been controlled by outside forces in any government. So the necessity with something as basic and as important as the right to a trial, the right to due process, the right to be able to face your accuser and to face a jury before being convicted of a crime, that's so crucial that it is important to practically make sure we stop the NDAA instead of just legally. If it was just legally, we'd lobby Congress. But at this point, it's practical. It goes beyond law. So at the local level is where you have the most ability to affect change, and where you have, even more important, the ability to ensure the change stays there, that it's right outside your house. I was on RT America, or Russia Today television, and I use the analogy of roadblocks. If you imagine this NDAA or any kind of tyranny coming to your town, and you imagine as a road, you have the road of government tyranny. Do you want to put the roadblock in Washington, D.C., 10,000, 6,000 miles, 4,000 miles away? Do you want to put it at your state capital, 200 miles away? Or do you want to put it right outside your house, 3 or 4 miles away? Which one are they less likely to be able to steal in the middle of the night, go around, find ways around, etc.? So we encourage people to go to the local level to make sure we are practically doing something instead of giving people a false sense of security. And we have 3-phase process. Number 1 is to pass the Restoring Constitutional Governance Resolution, a law that essentially applies the Constitution to the NDAA, therefore making it and the laws of war that I've talked about that back it illegal. Secondly, we encourage people to go to their local police or sheriff's department to institute policy and to ensure that, because when you institute police or sheriff policy, each member of the department actually has to sign a paper and it goes into their personnel file. So this says, if an officer allows someone to violate the resolution in such and such city or such and such county, they'll be fired. In a sheriff's department, it's a little bit easier because there's no unions. In a police department, it's somewhat more difficult. You have to go through a process. Nonetheless, that's the end result. And finally, to set up a citizens' watch of sorts to report police and military raids in the area, because they could use the police. All the NDAA says is the military takes care of you in the end. We can send whoever we want. So military or police raid to check for a warrant and to make sure that they are following their resolution instead of just passing resolutions against the Patriot Act, which 403 cities have done, and that just kind of makes you feel good and gives you butterflies, and your rights are still being taken out from under your carpet.
Nothing. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
I guess this is what, and you're right, and I mean, I think with people like me, I'm still kind of getting my head around that of local action in response to federal, because you have to get over the idea of them just being just able at the drop of a hat to do whatever they want. And I guess the one thing Toxin loves talking about is how the Bundy thing, let's say, in response to even a small amount of resistance, they run scared because in a lot of ways, like you point out, they don't have enough people. Like people always talk about, the government rolling in. Well, what is the government really when you operationalize it like that, like a mob of people? They're going to need, like you said, they can't just roll into a city and take it over without a lot of local cooperation, right? I mean, that seems to be their Achilles heel that they need at some level. A lot of times, local help.
It goes beyond local cooperation.
Denying them that cuts the legs out from under it, right?
It also takes military cooperation, is my take. And I've written about this a lot. I've talked about this on the show a lot. That kind of nullification doesn't just happen at the local level. It does actually happen in the ranks of the federal government itself. Because, I know a lot of federal employees, I know a lot of military, and a lot of police, and they're people. And a lot of them, I won't say all of them, but a lot of them are as unhappy about this as we are, if they understand what's going on. So the military is kind of a peculiar thing, and I get in this argument a lot with people that are apologists for federalism and just, these hooligans that want to nullify federal law. And and actually this the gun control debate this becomes a big one. Like as if you could actually stand up to the government with your guns, and the military gets like, well, no, the military wouldn't get me, because the military wouldn't likely follow an order to start confiscating people's guns or to do the kind of thing that you're talking about here, Dan. And that's kind of my message here is if you force the government to actually use the military on its own population, 4 out of 5 chance it's probably done. At that point, that government is over with. I mean, if you look at the Arab Spring, it sort of worked for al-Assad, but it didn't work for Mubarak, it didn't work for Zina in Tunisia, it didn't work in Yemen, because the military sourced from the people. So it's one thing when you're allowing the military to engage in atrocities against people in other countries, because they're there to fight the other country anyway. But it's a different idea when you're kind of unleashing them on your own soil. So if you deter the local police who actually have relationships with the people and the state police from participating in this, you're really putting a significant barrier to federal overreach. I mean, what do you think on that?
I would, in this case, because anytime the federal government is going to risk, if they were to use this in the way they would like to, which is to silence political speech, as every government around the world has used this power for, is to silence political speech or silence speech that they feel shouldn't be said. If they were to use it in that, they're taking a huge risk, because the public backlash that could come on them if they were to screw an operation like that up is huge. If there were a wrong door, you ended up in Guantanamo Bay raid instead of a wrong door drug raid, that is a huge public relations disaster for the government to contend with. So if they're willing to risk that already, if they're willing to risk a public relations disaster to get you, then they obviously don't really care whether or not the police or local government helps or not. At that point, they've made the decision to go get you. And this is why I think definitions and words mean something. I think definitions are really important to define what we're doing here. We are not nullifying. That is very important to understand the true spirit, I guess, behind the NDAA resistance and behind PANDA. We are not nullifying. Nullification there are several issues with it, but number one, it is going after the text of the law. I don't care what the text of the law is. I could care less what's on a piece of paper. What's on a piece of paper just gives you a hint as to the way they might use it. What is important is how it's used. And so we're taking a strategy best known and described by the founders, who actually didn't endorse nullification, but endorsed interposition. Interposition is against the action itself. We're interposing ourselves between. Yes, it may put a little bit of a barrier between the military from detaining someone if the state or local police don't help. But if it will put that much of a barrier, how much more of a barrier is put when local police not only say we won't help, but as our resolutions and the police policy requires, they won't let you do it. What military, private, officer, NCO is going to shoot a cop?
Yeah, I guess it's difficult to picture that. It is.
Right.
Especially if they shot more than one. I mean, could you imagine that the police are already seen as more on the people's side anyway in that community? So could you imagine the uproar and the distrust the government would sow in that community by doing that? Just practically. I understand that's a lot of violence to imagine, but the fact of the matter is we're dealing with a very dangerous situation, and we need to be practical about how we handle it instead of just legal. And at that point, if the officer says, no, you're not coming in here, would they really pull a gun on local law enforcement? I don't think they would.
I guess the only thing that scares me, and I don't want to harp on this, but in Katrina, you kind of had that. The military rolled in, and I guess maybe it's different in that at that time the local authorities were basically they were non-existent at that point. The police department wasn't even operating anymore. It was an empty city with no
they weren't
functioning.
Shooting
like
at the police, though. I mean,
well, right, but here's the thing: you had all the same hallmarks of people just being scooped up by the military, whether they were a threat to anyone or not. You had these people being shot on a bridge. That people forget about that thing happening, the Crescent City Connection Bridge. People were literally just shot because they were walking toward a military barricade trying to get out of the city. They weren't a threat to anybody, and yet they were just gunned down. And they rolled in with tanks, not trucks. So
well, here's a big difference, and here's why the law is so important. They didn't have a law on their side locally that said you can't do that explicitly.
That's true.
The Constitution has been reinterpreted so many times at this point that people who although I would disagree with them, that is a living document. People who would argue that, the way it's been treated, it might as well be. It might as well be just kind of oh, well, I guess we could refer to it, maybe. And if we do refer to it, it actually confirms what we want to do because we'll twist it that way.
More like guidelines anyway. It's like,
well, I mean, think about the drone memo released by the executive branch, or to NBC News not that long ago.
That was another horrifying one. Yeah.
Which redefined imminent to mean not imminent. Like it redefined imminent to mean the exact opposite of imminent. So if they can redefine that, they would very, very well redefine the Constitution and redefine what that means. So you didn't have, as one would say, the moral high ground. The people in New Orleans, when that happened, did not think they would have the moral high ground, and the police did not think they had the moral high ground to oppose the military coming in. However, you do that once or twice, and you have the people have the moral high ground, where look, we have a law on our side. It's illegal for you to do this. We know it because we've been here watching and making sure this won't happen. You have and it's not a guarantee by any means. Nothing's a guarantee. However, you're going to have a very much better chance to stop an action like that with local people and a local law than some random law, federal law. Let's say we repeal the NDAA and put in a prohibition at the federal level, some random federal law preventing them from going into your community and wreaking havoc.
Yeah, I think one thing the government had on their side was the element of surprise, and that hadn't happened before in modern times. Well, no one expected it.
That and the natural disaster.
And the natural disaster basically cutting all local resistance down.
Dan, we want to be respectful of your time, so we are out of time. We agreed on an hour. I just would like for you to let our listeners know a little bit more detail what they can do specifically. If they have an organization that they're in charge of, they want to form one, how they would contact you, how they would get in touch with PANDA, what they can basically do on their end. Like you said, it's not we, it's you. It is the listeners and people you hopefully show this podcast to. What you can do, what they can do to get in touch with Dan, to get in touch with PANDA, and how you can partner with PANDA, and how you can do this, how you can get started on this path.
You can contact us at pandaunite.org. We have a contact us link there. You can there's pandaunite.org/takeback, or if you Google search Panda Takeback, there is a packet along with the specific language of the resolution online right there that you can grab and take to your local community, as well as if you want our help. There's a little form just below that says, do you need help, essentially, and you can contact us. We'll help walk you through. We'll help move you in the right direction. All of the information is there. We need to do absolutely nothing to get it to you. It is all there. It is all ready for you to take back your community, take back your town, and stop this from happening at a local level. We can reach a turning point, and we've already got 7 cities, including the capital of New York, 7 jurisdictions, including the capital of New York, that have banned this. So why not your community? pandaunite.org/takeback.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you for being with us. We definitely appreciate it. Definitely very eye-opening. Definitely a bit different approach than what I advocate for sometimes, or what Joe advocates. But this is, we're all on the same page, and I think that really takes multiple approaches to defeat this. And, looking at our history, it is somewhat encouraging. This has been defeated every time it's happened, and it's a little different every time. So I think we're definitely, we're definitely doing a great job here. You guys are doing great work. I was very impressed when I came in touch with PANDA just to see how much work you guys have done, and just your network, and just the amount of connections and the amount of effort that has gone into this. So please, if you're listening, pandaunite.org, and thank you, Dan, for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, what do you think of that, Joe? Scary, huh? Terrifying. I'm not scared by much, but wow.
Again, like I said, I only knew about the 2012 one. It was interesting. He was talking about the parting shot for Bush. He didn't fuck us enough, completely helping to crash the economy in 2008. He had to basically go, oh, and all those rights that you thought you still had even after the Patriot Act, yeah, I'm going to take those too. Wasn't enough that you had Mr. Goldman Sachs running the Treasury and basically sacking the whole place on the way out. It was literally, he's like Kaiser Soze leaving a city. It's just burned down. And everyone's dead.
Really? Well,
God.
Obama hasn't exactly. Obama
but
came
then Bush went, oh, that's how you think you burn a city. Well, let me show you how you really burn a city, motherfucker. Get some Hellfire missiles on that son of a bitch.
Right, but then Obama came in.
Yeah.
He said, oh, no, the city's on fire. Oh, check it out.
Here's some gas.
Here's some gasoline. Yeah. It's just wow. Like I said, I'm not easily frightened. I'm not a skittish man, but this is just insanity.
He didn't bring it up. He brought up a little. But do you remember reading the Obama response when he signed the NDAA, knowing that it was going to basically be controversial? I won't actually use this stuff.
Well, it makes a lot more sense now that we've heard, like, the explicitly what it allows him to do. I mean, imagine if he'd said, of course I'm going to use this, I'm coming to your house tomorrow.
So I want everyone who thought, and I'm in this camp, I'll admit it, that, a constitutional law professor is president. That's exactly what we need after Bush violating the Constitution, right? Yeah, right. How's that feel now,
Obama's
America?
a constitutional law professor like I'm a Jedi Knight, but here's the...
Miss me yet?
Yeah. Well, here's kind of one point on this that I don't think gets made very often, but this is a point I'm always arguing with people and I'm always pointing at people and makes them very uncomfortable, which of course shows me I'm doing a good job with them. And that's what I call the pizza and bail bond syndrome. When we have laws that are necessary, like the NDAA. It's a necessary law. We have to authorize our national defense. That's not something you could wait. I mean, just like you have all these shutdowns and all that, and then things get shut down and things aren't working.
You mean that's a thing, right?
Right. So
we've been doing them 50 years.
Right.
So,
you have laws that are kind of, or like authorization acts, whatever. They're supposed to be neutral, and they're kind of a necessity, and we just expect that they're going to get done. So then politicians, knowing that shit is objectionable, and it's not going to go over well with the public, it's not going to go over well with other politicians, it's not going to go over well with the courts. They will attach things that are either completely unrelated or like slightly mildly related, and it's supposed to be temporary.
We call them earmarks.
Right. Two laws that have absolutely nothing to do with this. And again, these are objectionable provisions, and they're usually added at the 11th hour.
Was this like the thing that, I forget the law it was thrown onto, where you can carry guns in a national park? That was one of those ones that was paper clipped onto an unrelated law that was like had no chance of being turned down.
The one I always bring up is the one that banned online gambling. It was attached to a port safety bill because all those online poker transactions that go through the ports, we got to get rid of those. Those are a threat to port safety. It's ridiculous.
Goes through a port on a switch in a network closet somewhere, I guess.
Yeah, and
so there you go.
Right, and then politicians that oppose this, and there are politicians who oppose this kind of thing. They look at this. They're not voting on that provision. They're voting on the bill, and they're looking at it and saying, "Well, I could vote no on this, but then I'm going to get blamed for holding up a bill that's a necessity like the NDAA, and they're going to call me a traitor because this is the Defense Authorization Act, and this is our soldiers' paychecks, and just to keep our country safe." So it's just abuse of the legislative process through and through. And of course, the original NDAA, I want to remind everyone, the one that we're talking about, the 2012 one, that Rand Paul called Senate's bluff on this. They actually were trying to pass it without a roll call vote, or just on a voice vote, yeas or nays, because no senator wanted his name attached to voting yes on it. And they said, okay, well, hearing none, and Rand Paul said, nope, I want to vote on this. And then they actually removed a number of provisions as a result of that, actually making it was even worse before. So
hard to imagine that.
Right, so what I'm saying is, again, but this goes back to a point that I've made many times, that Joe and I have disagreed on many times, is just the federal government, just qualitatively, not quantitatively, is way out of its league on things it's supposed to be doing. It was never intended to have this many functions because it's too big and it's too far away from you for you to watch this kind of thing and pay attention to what it's doing. So it will start slipping by with these kind of actions because you can't possibly watch every little paper-clipped on amendment to a National Defense Authorization Act or just an act that gets passed every year. But you do have propaganda sources on both sides of the aisle. This is not a left or right thing. Please. Telling you, these politicians opposing it, they hate our military, and they hate the poor, and they hate the sick, and they're just like, just shut up.
Well, they set it up that way, right, so that they can do that. It's premeditated.
So, now, going back a little bit to nullification, and, we respect Dan, and we're very glad he was with us and talking about interposition, but my impression still, despite all this, and despite me feeling this is all very important and, a great topic to talk about and get involved with, is that Yes, the government has that capacity. And that's scary that it does, because it can abuse it and basically silence dissent speech. But the reason it stopped, in my opinion, the reason they stopped with the BLM versus the Cliven Bundy Ranch, is simply because they realized they would not win. I mean, the government considers a lot of things that it never actually goes through to doing. For example, when we first went into Iraq, there was a provision, there was a plan developed, this is documented, to invade 7 countries. 7 more countries, counting Iraq, but not counting Afghanistan. Syria and Iran were all on the list. These were all kind of...
Was that in the authorization, you mean?
Well, I'm not sure where this was. This is a proposal. It never went... It was a plan that was written.
Was that the one that they said they wrote before 9/11, where they were already kind of planning the Iraq War?
No, it was after 9/11, but it was before the Iraq War. And a lot of it was it was basically Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld.
Of course,
yeah. And there's a lot of kind of tinfoil hat activism out there, saying that, see, they were going to invade all these countries. I'm like, well, no, some people wanted to invade all those countries. So the government considered it. Okay, it considers a lot of things. Is that scary? Absolutely. Is it safe to assume they would have done it? I'm not sure. The thing is, my impression, as just analyzing policy and being an organizer, is that that proposal was rejected in large part because they realized it really would not go well. Because the connections that Cliven Bundy has, and look into this, research this, he's not just some crazy rancher with 20 other guys with guns. He's got all these militias from all the flyover states around him. And he's got a lot of connections with the Mormon Church, and that's a very organized entity that has its own militias. So you were going to have a much bigger standoff. If there were shots fired, the military showed up, it would have been 10, 20 times as many people out there as there were when it was actually going down.
The one thing I guess gives me hope is that it's much easier in the age now of Twitter and Facebook and whatnot, just with cell phones the way they are now and text messaging, is how easy it is to communicate on a mass scale quickly. You can mount an outrage campaign very fast. Look how quickly everyone knew what a racist Donald Sterling was, for example.
Right.
And I hate to harp on Katrina, but once again I'm going to bring it up. I guess the thing that scares me about that isn't even just the military anymore, and we didn't talk about this earlier with Dan, but I want to bring it up, is now under Obama, and Bush could have done this just as easily, but we have so much surplus military gear now, and we're pulling out all these wars. Well, where's that stuff going to go? In a big desert lot like we park planes out there when the flights, the air travel goes down? No. You know what they did? They took a bucket of paint out, blue, gray,
black,
whatever,
sometimes,
painted it, and then airbrushed on the name of your local police department on the side of it. So now instead of U.S. Army on the side of the mine-resistant personnel carrier that they had in Afghanistan, now it came back, and it's only got about 10,000 miles on it, mostly freeway, running from city to city,
Florida to Arizona,
to Crete to Mosul, whatever, no big deal. It didn't really see any combat action. So now, see, it's sitting in your police department's garage, just in case, whatever. And that's what I worry about when, I guess the one takeaway from what Dan was saying about attacking this at the local level, you know what, we can treat this like just some federal thing all we want, and say, we just say fuck the federal government and that's the end of it. No. Like we said already, they're exporting this shit. And it's only a matter of time. If they're talking to governors, how long is it going to be before governors start talking to mayors? I mean, come on.
Are already.
And some mayors of certain cities are seen as powerful as governors, like you'd say Rahm Emanuel of Chicago, or the mayor of New York City. They're in profile. They're as big as a governor of, like, say, Iowa. More people know who the mayor of New York is than the governor of Iowa right now, right?
Oh, absolutely, right.
On average. So, I mean, it's like I said before, it's a very short journey from one to the other. From it being a federal thing to being a local thing. And I forget the article, it was in the New York Times. So this is not a tinfoil hat right-wing, militia newsletter that's talking about this. It's the New York frickin' Times about tanks and armed personnel. Remember when a cop used to be wearing a shirt and a hat and a badge and pants, and they'd come to your school, they had a gun, wow, that was a big deal. Now you see cops. I was just down the street here, near my house, I saw 5 cops. It was unclear what in the hell they were doing, but they were kind of, one was here, 2 were by a car talking to some dude, like it all looked very strange. But the thing that struck me is they were just walking around, and okay, I don't live in a very high crime area of town, okay? Look, let's just say the average price of a house within a stone's throw of me is just south of $1 million. Let's just say that. So the words ocean view are on a lot of them. Let's just say that. high-class area, right? Money, not the ghetto. These guys are walking around in flak jackets. They look like they were on a battlefield. And when we talk about this idea of a battlefield in America, I mean, this is not that far from being true already in a lot of, let's say, codified policy in the part of not just military, not just federal government, but local police department. When they're seeing every resident as a potential armed combatant to them, I mean, that's a dangerous time, isn't it?
And the way I see this, and what you're saying, absolutely, Joe, I agree with you. And, I mean, if you look at some local police and local authorities, like Sheriff Joe Arpaio, not to name any names, but...
he does think of himself as like the sheriff of Nottingham or some Wild West, hero sheriff that just kills and hangs him high from the next tree. And what is he, 100? Can that guy fucking die already? Right. Speaking of which,
want to be declared a terrorist now?
Can't nature take its course already? Shit, how was that guy 85 and fat?
His blood pressure's got to be through the roof with all that yelling about how Obama's a traitor, right?
Exactly.
So here's the thing, but being serious for a second, yes, some of these local authorities that we are looking to empower with what PANDA is doing, obviously some of them may be worse than the federal government. I agree completely there. They may be dangerous. In many places, they're clearly and abjectly and openly racist. At least they're not apologetic about it. It's like, no, my granddaddy was in the care, and apple doesn't fall far from the tree in this part of the South. And I mean, this is not information that I'm not privy to. I'm not naive by any stretch of the imagination. My take on authority and on power has always been that the only way you're going to survive in a world where there are powerful authorities is by sicking them against each other. So honestly, if you have the BLM and these just detached federal bureaucrats trying to abuse this authority that Obama now has to execute and take down American citizens, and they want to roll into a place similar to where Sheriff Arpaio is the sheriff, or what is it? What's the county?
He is Maricopa County.
Maricopa County, yeah. Right? And the sheriffs from that county are all lined up with their guns and their, they bought their personnel carriers from the same place. It's like before they start shooting, they say, "Hey guys, how's that model working out? Yeah, how do we use this? Can you show us?"
Once again, our shit versus our shit, I guess, right?
If they want to do that, I say let them. Let them have each other. I'm not taking a side. I'm trying to teach the individual how to survive against these just crazed collectives that think you're supposed to surrender your civil liberties and surrender your private property and just basically surrender your right to say, I disagree with you, and because you have a uniform and a fucking badge does not change that fact.
Right.
I'm trying to get people to learn how to survive in that world, and I think we've forgotten that's always a battle. This country was founded on the idea that that's a battle. And it's always been there. And, every 50 or 60 years, just as Dan pointed out, we kind of tend to forget. And then we end up in this situation. And I think rather than trying to make it work, I say let them destroy each other. This is not a bad thing. I'm not, just because I always talk about nullification and kind of defederation and state rights and cities and all that. Doesn't mean I necessarily like city government or state government. I most certainly do not. What I want to induce is competition. Because when you have competition, even between cities or between states, the one kind of redeeming factor, even if the governments may be worse than the federal, is that people can leave. They can go from one city to the next. And that destroys that city's economy, giving that city incentive to basically treat its citizens better and to be more reasonable and more in touch with reality. It's very difficult to leave a state, especially a larger state like the one we're in, and are you really going to tell people to leave the country and go to, if you want to be a libertarian, go to Somalia. If you want to be a socialist, go to Sweden. I mean, how many times have you heard that crap?
I guess that's a good note to as a final wrap up thing. But I guess my thing is, my final note is really we can't take that for granted that we're supposed to have certain rights. And when I say supposed to, you always recoil. But anyway, if the Constitution is supposed to apply, right, when it's by its very words it's supposed to apply to everybody equally under the law, we can't be willing. I think the most poisonous thing is that people are lulled into wanting to just give that away. Benjamin Franklin talked about the danger of doing that. It doesn't end well, ever. I just want to get that point across. Anytime in history where we're like, well, okay, it's okay if I don't have this right anymore, if you can do this and this and this. The point is, they can always make up some kind of nebulous other enemy to hate. There's no shortage of that. Human hysteria is easy to prey on, so don't get fooled by that. Don't get tricked into giving up, what's rightfully yours. Let's say it's always a battle. So let's not get complacent. I guess that's my wrap up note there. So I just want to thank everybody for listening, and thank once again Dan Johnson for being with us, and for Neurotoxin. I'm Joe Ryan. Thank you for listening to The Edge of Chaos.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to The Edge of Chaos. We can be found on the internet at edgeofchaospodcast.com. That's edgeofchaospodcast.com. Contact the show, edgeofchaospodcast@gmail.com. Follow us on Twitter at Edge of Chaos Show. We can also be found on Facebook at facebook.com/The Edge of Chaos. Neurotoxin's blog can be found at neurotoxins with an S, FYG, at blogspot.com. My blog can be found at joeryansworld.blogspot.com. For Neurotoxin, this is Joe Ryan. Thank you for listening to The Edge of Chaos.
Here's one more item for you, the last in our civics book. Rights. Boy, everyone in this country is always running around yammering about their fucking rights. I have a right, you have no right, we have a right, they don't have a right. Folks, I hate to spoil your fun, but there's no such thing as rights, okay? They're imaginary. We made them up, like the boogeyman. The Three Little Pigs, Pinocchio, Mother Goose, shit like that. Rights are an idea. They're just imaginary. They're a cute idea. Cute. But that's all. Cute and fictional. But if you think you do have rights, let me ask you this. Where do they come from? People say, well, they come from God. They're God-given rights. Oh, fuck, here we go again. Here we go again. The God excuse. The last refuge of a man with no answers and no argument. It came from God. Anything we can't describe must have come from God. Personally, folks, I believe that if your rights came from God, He would have given you the right to some food every day, and He would have given you the right to a roof over your head. God would have been looking out for you. God would have been looking out for you. You know that? He wouldn't have been worried about making sure you have a gun so you can get drunk on Sunday night and kill your girlfriend's parents. But let's say it's true. Let's say God gave us these rights. Why would He give us a certain number of rights? The Bill of Rights in this country has 10 stipulations, okay? 10 rights. And apparently God was doing sloppy work that week because we've had to amend the Bill of Rights an additional 17 times. So God forgot a couple of things like slavery. Just fucking slipped His mind. But let's say God gave us the original 10. He gave the British 13. The British Bill of Rights has 13 stipulations. The Germans have 29. The Belgians have 25. The Swedish have only 6. And some people in the world have no rights at all. What kind of a fucking goddamn God-given deal is that? No rights at all? Why would God give different people in different countries different numbers of different rights? Boredom? Amusement? Bad arithmetic? Do we find out at long last after all this time that God is weak in math skills? Doesn't sound like divine planning to me. Sounds more like human planning. Sounds more like one group trying to control another group. In other words, business as usual in America. Now, if you think you do have rights, one last assignment for you. Next time you're at the computer, get on the internet, go to Wikipedia. When you get to Wikipedia, in the search field for Wikipedia, I want you to type in Japanese Americans 1942, and you'll find out all about your precious fucking rights, okay? All right. You know about it. You know about it. Yeah. In 1942, there were 110,000 Japanese American citizens in good standing, law-abiding people who were thrown into internment camps simply because their parents were born in the wrong country. That's all they did wrong. They had no right to a lawyer, no right to a fair trial, no right to a jury of their peers, no right to due process of any kind. The only right they had, right this way, into the internment camps. Just when these American citizens needed their rights the most, their government took them away. And rights aren't rights if someone can take them away. They're privileges. That's all we've ever had in this country is a bill of temporary privileges. And if you read the news even badly, you know that every year the list gets shorter and shorter and shorter. You see how sooner or later? Yeah. Sooner or later, the people in this country are going to realize the government does not give a fuck about them. Government doesn't care about you or your children or your rights or your welfare or your safety. It simply doesn't give a fuck about you. It's interested in its own power. That's the only thing, keeping it and expanding it wherever possible. Personally, when it comes to rights, I think one of two things is true. I think either we have unlimited rights or we have no rights at all. Personally, I lean toward unlimited rights. I feel, for instance, I have the right to do anything I please. But if I do something you don't like, I think you have the right to kill me. So where are you going to find a fairer fucking deal than that? So the next time some asshole says to you, I have a right to my opinion, you say, oh yeah? Well, I have a right to my opinion, and my opinion is you have no right to your opinion. Then shoot the fuck and walk away. Thank you.